good evening, those of you joining us. My name is Victoria Verge. I'm the curator here at the Vernon Public Art Gallery. Thanks for coming, both virtually and in person. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the Vernon Public Art Gallery is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation, and we're grateful to live, work, and gather and share art on these lands. And we recognize the ongoing presence, knowledge, and stewardship of the Syilx people. Tonight's artist talk is presented in conjunction with Mary Kavanagh's exhibition, Opera Obscura, on view here at the gallery until October 7th. The exhibition brings together sculpture, installation, and photography to consider the archive as both a physical and cultural space, asking questions about preservation and erasure, visibility and absence, and how decisions are made about what knowledge is kept, valued, or allowed to disappear. It's my pleasure to introduce Mary Kavanagh, a Canadian visual artist, professor of art, and Board of Governors Research Chair at the University of Lethbridge. For the past 3 decades, Mary has developed an extensive research-based practice through fieldwork, residencies, military embeds, archival research, and interdisciplinary collaboration across Canada and internationally. Working across photography, moving image, drawing, and installation, her work investigates sites shaped by nuclear colonialism, militarization, and industrial extraction, with a sustained interest in memory, secrecy, collection, inscription, and the archive. Her work has been exhibited at institutions including the Canadian War Museum, the Albuquerque Museum, the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery, and the Art Gallery of Alberta. Major projects include Daughters of Uranium, Seven Skies of Maralinga, Trinity, Shadow Archive, and of course, Opera Obscura. Mary is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a member of the board, and a member of the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts. Now, quickly before I hand things over to Mary, I'll just mention some housekeeping notes for this evening. Mary's talk will go for about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A period. For those of us joining us on Zoom, we please ask you to keep your cameras and microphones off just while the lecture portion is happening, and then you can come on back in when we start doing the Q&A, and you're welcome to turn your cameras and microphones on then. And just one final thing, I'll mention that tonight's talk is being recorded, so if you know of anyone who'd be interested in checking it out at a later date, we'll be able to have it up on our website. And that's it for me. Thank you for joining us, and it's my pleasure to welcome you, Mary.
Thank you. Thanks, Victoria. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks everyone for being here this evening, especially this hot summer evening. We have about an hour together, and during that time, I'll share some thoughts about the new body of work currently presented at the gallery, which I've been working on for the better part of the past year. I know that some of you are in the gallery sitting with the exhibition, and some of you are online. So those of you there, please feel free to engage the work directly and offer any comments or ask any questions that may arise following the talk. First, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Victoria Verge for inviting me to exhibit in Vernon. When she first approached me, she had other work in mind, but the invitation arrived just as I was in the early stages of working with these books. It was new and untested terrain. And as our conversations unfolded, Victoria brought intellectual curiosity and energy to the exploration, and her trust in my process played an important part in allowing the work to develop without quite knowing where it would lead. So thank you again for this opportunity. I also want to thank Donna Kennedy, Executive Director, and the gallery's amazing installation team, as well as the men from the Shed Vernon who built and installed the large platform that holds the books. So during installation week, I just want to mention that the wildfires in the surrounding region affected Vernon and the local communities directly and created a period of uncertainty and suspended time that ultimately led to the postponement of the exhibition's opening events, which of course is why we're gathered here this evening. And those circumstances have become embedded in my experience of bringing the work into the gallery. And finally, further to the acknowledgement that we're located on the unceded territories of the Syilx Okanagan peoples, I would like to acknowledge that this work was made primarily in Lethbridge, Alberta, on the traditional territory of the Blackfoot peoples. Opera Obscura began in earnest in the summer of 2025 when I was gifted approximately 2,000 books deaccessioned through the University of Lethbridge Library's annual collection review. Historic, out of print, and often very beautiful objects. Confronted by the physicality of this collection and the criteria that rationalized the book's removal from public circulation, I responded by covering their surfaces with black ink, one book, then another, gestures of memorialization that paradoxically unfolded as preservation. The more I worked, the more I felt the intellectual and emotional labor embedded in each book and the communities encircling each author. Inking became a form of witnessing, of sitting with what Walter Benjamin describes as the collector's bind, that books do not belong to us so much as we belong to them, inhabited by what we have gathered. So this is how my statement begins for the exhibition publication that is forthcoming. But there are other origin stories for this work. In truth, Opera Obscura emerged long before last summer. It emerged from 30 years of working within the university sector and observing year after year, hallway after hallway, books sitting boxed on floors beside faculty offices, free for the taking, in the hope that a passerby might rescue a few volumes and thereby save them from the landfill. After scholars spend careers building specialized research and teaching collections, the discard of these collections has disturbed me deeply, that there is seemingly nowhere for these books to go. And I know I'm not alone in thinking this. The work also emerged from a long period in my art practice focused on the atomic era and from a rising restlessness, maybe boredom, with the nuclear subject. Not that the subject is boring, but framing my work through that lens was becoming increasingly difficult. I sensed that beneath the discursive vastness of nuclear culture lay something simpler, human, universal, that has to do with knowledge, with the control, suppression, and distortion of information, which are so much a part of the conversations we are all having today, which ultimately lead to discussions of power and capital. We can return to this. And it emerged from a dream. I dreamed of a field filled with books laid to waste, blackened, row upon row, like a city charred in the aftermath of fire or bombs. I began with one book, pulled from my own library. I covered it with ink, watery, dark, pages buckling, its slab-like form newly legible. And there it sat, obdurate, silent, attuned to writing. I inked another and another, multiple washes of ink. I developed methods for flattening, trying to press the ripples from the paper. I went looking for a supply of books, knowing their numbers mattered, rejecting any source that required payment, which ultimately led me to the library. When I contacted the university library to ask whether any books were being removed that year, this is the University of Lethbridge Library, I was invited into a back room to have a look. The head of collections generously offered to donate as many as I needed for the project. The books I did not take would be shipped to a central repository and sorted for possible use by other centers. Those not considered relevant or of interest would eventually be discarded. Library collection reviews generally focus on selected disciplines, one or several at a time. This one primarily involved modern languages and psychology, which then determined the particular character of the collection I received and worked with. I made many trips to the library's 11th floor. With the support of the librarians and assistants, I boxed books that had been processed out of circulation, wheeled them to my car, drove them home to my studio, where they were unloaded, unpacked, and sorted again. The sheer volume and mass of the collection were undeniable. As the piles grew, my understanding shifted from the abstract to the specific. These books from this library at this moment, and then outward again toward all books and toward the library and archive writ large across time. Two quotations remained close to me during the making of Opera Obscura. They speak to concerns that run through this work, as well as many of my earlier projects. The relationship between order and disorder, the archive and its material remains, and the ways the past continues to act upon the present. In his 1931 essay, Unpacking My Library, Walter Benjamin writes, "For what else is this collection but a disorder to which habit has accommodated itself to such an extent that it can appear as order?" Benjamin wrote this essay while unpacking approximately 2,000 books that had remained in storage after the dissolution of his marriage and the loss of his family home. The collection offered material continuity during a period of displacement 2 years earlier, during a period of displacement, and 2 years later, he would be forced into exile and separated again from his beloved library. Benjamin describes a private collection shaped by personal acquisition, each object ripe with personal association, encounters, and memory. But his observation extends to the public library with an order that is contingent, though may appear settled, an order produced through systems of selection, classification, preservation, and removal. While making Opera Obscura, I became increasingly attentive to this tension between order and disorder, and between the singularity of each book and the collection that holds it and makes it legible. The second passage I'll share comes from Peter Van Wyck's The Highway of the Atom, in which he develops the concept of the territorial archive. He says, "The territorial archive includes all of the material and immaterial deposits, residues, and remnants from which the living may transform a past into the realm of active and ongoing memory. A territorial archive is that matrix from which the past is transformed by the present, not as history, as mere record of past events, but as sites of active and ongoing concern." Van Wyck develops this idea through the route along which uranium traveled from Port Radium on Great Bear Lake into the military and industrial networks of the atomic age. The territorial archive is therefore neither bounded nor inert. It encompasses material deposits and immaterial traces that extend beyond official records, and in this case included mine tailings, contaminated lands, abandoned infrastructures, boats and barges, testimony, and the continuing experiences of the Satu Dene peoples. My understanding of the archive has developed between these two scales, Benjamin's intimate collection and Van Wyck's extended territory. Although Opera Obscura turns towards the library, it emerges from a much longer engagement I have had with histories materially inscribed in land, atmosphere, bodies, objects, and built environments. So next I'm going to attempt to trace some of these connections through several earlier projects before returning to the books. One of my early works, Distillation in Her Element, began with a collection of antique glass laboratory vessels given to me by my grandmother, Mary Kavanagh. Both of my grandparents were career chemists, and after the Second World War, they acquired the contents of several organic chemistry laboratories at auction prior to building a working lab in the basement of their Toronto home. The laboratory became a kind of childhood playground, forbidden, secret, a place of lurking danger and mystery. I spent hours among the instruments, shelves of bottled chemicals, glass orbs, and spirals, each piece wearing a thin skin of dust that seemed to have become part of the glass itself, evidence of time and obsolescence, not to be disturbed. When the collection eventually came to me, I felt a deep sense of responsibility to honor it and to understand why it mattered to so many. The result was Distillation, first exhibited in 1998, a matrix of sharpened steel rods suspending 200 glass vessels, like a laboratory of fantastic proportion. The metalwork was hand fabricated in the physics machine shop at the University of Saskatchewan, with Edison Del Canto and I working together to turn each rod into a needle-like point, cutting and drilling the hundreds of clamps by hand. A passage I wrote at the time reveals my early preoccupation with collecting and collections. I debated whether or not to share it, but I will. So it goes like this. I had removed things on occasion, and there they would sit, out of place, insignificant. One time I brought everything back, assuaging my guilt of these small thefts, delivering the glass objects to the context of their own plenitude, knowing somehow that their meaning derived from their collective existence. Probably all the family members had at one time or another taken a piece of glass, a labeled bottle, a ceramic dish, as souvenir of this place. And a decay had gradually settled in, a slow deterioration, a nearly imperceptible diminishing that went on for decades. Dust became a more explicit subject in another project called Shadow Archive, gathered from the same ancestral family home that held the laboratory. At the point of the house's sale, as its rooms were emptied, I collected, bagged, and labeled what remained, organizing the material by location into a grid of 100 transparent bags. What would ordinarily have been swept away became a form of evidence. Dust is an indiscriminate collector. It gathers particles of bodies, skin, objects, and buildings, becoming a register of habitation, change, disturbance, and time. By classifying these residues, the work sought clues about the lives lived in the house, through what was forgotten, overlooked, or left unseen. A kind of forensic attention that has come to characterize much of my work. Polish extended this inquiry into material culture beyond the personal and familial sphere. Over 3 years, I gathered about 1,000 tarnished silver-plated objects, the discards of other people's lives. The objects were arranged along a 24-foot table, part banquet, part trade fair. At its head, a woman sat polishing. Each object or set of objects had been labeled and assigned a linen napkin. As the polishing progressed, the small identifying tags were removed from the objects and pinned to the corresponding napkins. The polishing was done by hired attendants, allowing the work to hold several registers at once: domestic labor, women's work, generational knowledge, colonial and settler histories, the slow economies by which objects become obsolete. And here's a detail. You can make out the little identifying tags. The soiled napkins were ultimately stitched together, becoming a companion textile piece titled Tarnish that draped down a wall and across the floor like a large veil or an oversized drawing, its layered marks carrying erasure and inscription, touch, time, and residue. Surface oxidation became a vital material substance in this work, transferred from object to cloth, in a gesture that might be considered one of repair. Over time, this attention to objects, residues, and material evidence moved outward into projects that engaged fieldwork at military and atomic sites. The work depended upon repeated return and upon forms of access that were often temporary and conditional. Residencies, military embeds, security clearances, and guided entry into places ordinarily closed to public view. One of these projects that I'll discuss was Trinity. I began working at the site of the world's first atomic bomb test in the New Mexico desert in 2014, returning over the course of a decade during public open house days when thousands of visitors are granted temporary access to the still active White Sands Missile Range. With each visit, I added another layer of photographs, recordings, observations, documents, and encounters to my growing understanding of the place. The project took three principal forms. One was called Atomic Tourist. For the next decade, I recorded more than 250 visitor testimonies, amassing an archive of voices that traces something of the collective psychic imprint of the nuclear age. People came as tourists and pilgrims, carrying family histories, military connections, political convictions, curiosity, awe, grief, and uneasy inheritance. Here's a sample grid that includes all of the participants in the project in the year 2015. These were collected in a single day of filming during an annual open house from about 8 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. So each of the open house days were like little marathons of conducting these interviews, quite exhilarating. I created annual grids of participants for each year that I conducted this field work. Here's one more sample from 2014 showing the participants that year. I've transcribed all the video and audio interviews, and I'm currently working on creating a selection of edited image and text pairings, a curated selection of these encounters that will form a visual essay mapping how the Trinity event continues to register in lived experience. The testimonies complicate the official narratives through which the site is presented and understood. And here's one example. Catherine Begay, who I interviewed in 2017, and she talks about the impact of uranium mining on Navajo lands. Another example, Paul Griego from 2019. He was part of the cleanup of the Pacific Islands in the 1970s, and he discussed his role in the construction of the Runit Dome at Eniwetok Atoll. Working with material records always results in unexpected finds and tangents. When I was going through the material this past fall, I produced a series called Embrace of individuals whose affect in front of the camera went beyond a conventional interview. At the top is Adam and Isolde from 2015, and the bottom is The Wedding, 2014. Another form of the project manifests as a two-channel video installation titled Trinity 3, in which archival footage of the bomb's construction, testimonies gathered on site, and my own footage are edited into a montage. Presented across a span of 32 feet, the work brings historical record, embodied memory, and the contemporary military landscape into immersive and discordant relation. It's another view of the installation. This is at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery. Another work that resulted from the research was a series of large format diptych photographs. In this pairing, the obelisk that marks ground zero at the Trinity test site is photographed on a clear day during one of the private tours I had of the White Sands Missile Range. I was left alone at the site for over an hour to get the shot, a remarkable experience. This image depicts the site as peaceful desert ringed with mountains, interrupted with a diminutive-looking obelisk at its center. The image is paired with one from Berlin Brixner's 1945 photographic archive of the Trinity test. Each of the compositions in this series illuminates different aspects of the range on which the Trinity atomic bomb test was conducted, as well as evidence left in its aftermath. I often use juxtaposition as a visual strategy. Pairings suggest connection and destabilization without a clear center. Natural forms, yucca, sumac, lava rock, are placed next to military artifacts and architectural remains documented across the range. The title of this series, Trinity Equivalents, is also a nod to Alfred Stieglitz's Equivalents, his early 20th century photographs of clouds, while shifting the idea of equivalence toward uneasy relationships. In this image, the panel on the left shows the residual ring left by the Trinity test on the desert floor. I took the photograph while standing on the Obscura mountain peak, the highest point on the range, and it is paired with a sumac bush growing in the white sand dunes. The Trinity test occurred on July 16, 1945, a singular material event that is often understood as the start of the nuclear Anthropocene. But the site cannot be confined to that date. It persists as a historical landmark within an active military range, at once a monument to scientific achievement and a place inseparable from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, from Cold War atomic testing programs, from nuclear colonialism, and from the continuing experience of downwinder communities in New Mexico and across the globe. Trinitite is the glassy residue forged in the inferno of the Trinity bomb. When sand and debris from the desert floor were drawn up into the fireball, melted there, and returned to Earth as molten radioactive glass. The material contains remnants of the bomb's support structures, as well as radionuclides produced by the detonation. Geologists describe such glass as carrying forensic information through which the specific atomic device can be identified. Traces of this green glass remain on site today, although much of the material was cleared in the early 1950s. I was gifted these 25 pieces from Cami Montoya, public affairs specialist at the White Sands Missile Range. The second group of fragments is rubble I gathered near the atomic bomb hypocenter in Hiroshima in 2007. These stones remained in my studio for more than 10 years before they found form in the work. In another example of juxtaposition, I brought the trinitite in relationship with the Hiroshima rubble, pairing material residues from the two defining sites of the atomic age. Trinity, where the weapon was first tested, and Hiroshima, where it was first used against a human population. These fragments carry radically different histories and serve as signifiers of the events themselves. I think of them as embodying different forms of material evidence, fragments through which distant sites and histories are brought into discursive relationship. I included this image as an example of my ongoing collecting practice. And inside each jar, there's a substance that are been gathered from different field visits to military and other sites. From 1952 to 1963, the British government, with the active participation of the Australian government, conducted 12 major nuclear weapons tests and up to 600 minor trials in the South Australian outback and off the Western Australian coast. Radioactive contamination from the tests was then detected across much of the continent. The resulting contamination was systematically denied, minimized, and concealed for decades on Aboriginal land that in places remains restricted today, with cleanup and reconciliation efforts beginning in the 1990s. In May of 2024, I traveled to Maralinga and I toured the 100 square mile testing range where 7 atomic bombs were detonated within the much larger territory of the Great Victoria Desert. At each of the 7 test sites, I photographed the sky above. The resulting work, 7 Skies of Maralinga, consists of 7 vertically oriented photographs installed in sequence, each identified by the name and details of the corresponding bomb test. Clouds and skies have long been associated with transcendence, abstraction, and expression. Here, however, the sky is grounded by events tied to a place of historical and continuing violence, a propositional paradox. The photographs raise questions about sight and containment in an era of radioactive fallout and toxic drift. Each image records the atmosphere above a precise location at a precise moment, yet the atmosphere itself cannot be fixed. It moves across territorial boundaries, carrying matter with it. In this instance, atmosphere is portrayed as both fixed and transient. A detail of one of the 7 Skies images titled One Tree, Operation Buffalo, 12.9 kiloton yield, tower, 27th September, 1956. I continue to think about the sky, especially in relation to the limits of representation. In a series of works on small panels, I turned to gold leaf and lapis lazuli, 2 of the most precious materials historically used to render the heavens. I sourced genuine 24-karat gold leaf from Manetti, a 400-year-old Florentine firm that still practices the traditional art of gold beating, and the lapis lazuli from Master Pigments, which produces the pigment extracted from Afghan stone and follows a recipe attributed to the 14th century Italian painter Cennino Cennini. Each panel is 8 inches square, and again, they're displayed together in a diptych format. Nuclear testing produces a terrible reversal of that old alchemy, where gold and lapis brought the Earth's most precious substances into a painted sky. The bomb sends the Earth itself, dust, debris, and radioactive particles, into the atmosphere. In another representation of sky, I made a watercolor of a cyanometer. It's 14 inches square. The cyanometer was developed around 1789 by Swiss naturalist Horace Benedict de Saussure to measure the intensity of the sky's blue. Held against the sky, its graduated color scale translated atmospheric conditions into color and number, an instrument poised between scientific measurement and the subjective judgment of the observer's eye. Questions of air, containment, and ownership also enter a single drawing I made after Marcel Duchamp's Air de Paris. Duchamp once described himself as a breather. In 1919, while waiting at Le Havre to board a ship for New York, Duchamp entered a pharmacy and asked that the serum be emptied into a small glass ampule and the vessel resealed, trapping 50 cubic centimeters of Parisian air. He labeled it serum physiologique, suggesting a captive life force, and gave it to his friend and patron Walter Arensberg as a souvenir of Paris. This work was made in the same year that national sovereignty in France was extended to the air, which, it might be argued, Duchamp echoed in Air de Paris. The assertion of property, both political and aesthetic, in relation to air raises questions about public versus private claims upon air and atmosphere, or about the limits of the commons. The original ampule broke in 1949 and was repaired under Duchamp's supervision, with several additional versions subsequently produced. For my drawing, I worked from a photograph made in 1937, when the ampule purportedly still contained its original Paris air. I encountered the photograph reproduced as a postcard and pinned it to my studio wall, where I photographed it again as a source image for the drawing. The work is therefore a drawing of a photograph of a postcard of an object whose defining contents cannot be seen or verified. This turns us to the chemistry glass of distillation. Duchamp's ampule shares the material language of these inherited vessels, the delicate hand-formed glassware of the laboratory, poised between scientific instrument and enigmatic object. Across both works, glass functions as a fragile boundary between what can be contained and what can only be imagined. I'll return now to the books. This image shows a 3-volume dictionary of the German language compiled by Daniel Sanders and published by Leipzig Press between 1860 and 1865. I believe these are the oldest published volumes in my collection. And then here's an image of the same volumes after being inked. The interior of the same dictionary, this one from 1863. They all have different years on them. Another image of the interior. Here's an example of a book published in 1874, The Polar and Tropical Worlds, a description of man and nature in the polar and equatorial regions of the globe. The book holds 2 volumes with accounts of Arctic exploration and those of the tropical worlds, as they were called in the 19th century. Interior pages include 200 illustrated engravings commissioned for this quite amazing book. This image shows examples of 2 such engravings. As I continued to experiment with different materials, I came upon alcohol inks, a useful and unexpected discovery. Alcohol inks behave quite differently from the water-based inks I had been using. The pigment soaks into the paper, and then the excess alcohol almost immediately evaporates as it touches the surface. The pace of the work accelerated, the saturation improved, and each book required 2 coats of ink rather than 3 or 4. The ink was also very light, acting like a stain that preserves the material surfaces of the books, including metal foils or other resists that were part of the original printing and binding process. While I understood that the medium was toxic, I underestimated the cumulative effects of working with it, thinking I was taking care to not overexpose myself. I was opening the studio windows overnight and keeping the door closed between studio and house. But eventually the fumes caught up with me, and I had to stop the process for 2 months while I moved the entire inking operation out of the house and into a separate building. I improved the ventilation, got myself a good respirator, and even then, I could work only in short sessions, no more than 2 to 3 hours at a time. I mixed and applied the inks by hand, brushing covers, spines, and page edges in successive layers. As the inking continued, what I had imagined as an act of concealment became a way of attending more closely to each book's material differences. After a while, I recognized in this gesture the material reversal of polish. There, tarnish was removed from silver-plated objects and transferred onto linen, revealing the reflective surfaces beneath. Here, blackness was applied, obscuring the book's surfaces. In each work, transformation occurred through the labor of repetition and touch and the handling of one object after another. One encounter proved especially formative, beholding the 2-volume complete works of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettesheim, a 16th century polymath, Opera I and Opera II. Brick-like in heft, the books are precisely bound with gold lettering stamped across their covers and spines. Their interior pages are densely printed in Latin, now framed by the bleeding stain of my inking. From these volumes, the title for the project emerged: Opera, the plural of the Latin opus, meaning work, labor, or effort, suggests not a single work, but a body of works, the product of sustained human toil. Obscura, from obscurus, dark, hidden, withdrawn, names both a material condition and a state of disappearance. Together, the words suggest a body of labor that has been darkened or passed out of visibility. They also carry an echo of camera obscura, in which darkness becomes a condition of seeing. There are 4 photographs of this set of books, Opera 1 and 2, in the final series. This is one of them. And here again, the interior pages. The work developed through accumulation and through conversation. One of the great things about living in Lethbridge is its community of artists and people deeply engaged with art. As friends and colleagues visited the studio over the course of the year, each encounter opened another way of thinking about the books. One friend compared the black slabs to laptops. Another immediately understood the project as a continuum of my drawing practice. Another friend spent nearly an hour opening books, examining their pages, reading and sharing passages, and moving through the piles. He described an emotional avalanche building with each recognition of what was being lost. And following his initial encounter with the black monolith, he expressed relief upon discovering that the books remained intact, that their contents were still accessible, available for reading. That impulse to open the books, to look inside, led to a companion photographic series I call Black Book Studies. The series began with the idea of photographing interior pages from a cross-section of the collection, and it soon became a focused study of the volumes I found most compelling. Feels like the beginning of a much larger study. For this series, blackened books are isolated against an even darker ground and illuminated, allowing the subjects to almost shimmer from the darkness. Their covers, spines, typography, inscriptions, and signs of wear become visible, and the photographs restore a measure of particularity with each image inviting pause. I'll just move through a few more. This is a miniature 10-volume set, missing one, of the complete writings of Alexander Pushkin. The covers from the same set. A chorus of grammars. Art History's History. 4-volume Russian encyclopedic dictionary. And here's an image of the complete set of photographs installed, 32 in total. Gallery view of the installation and the photographic grids in relationship to one another. In the end, approximately 2,000 volumes are installed across a low plinth measuring 16 by 16 feet. They form a dense gridded field that echoes the serial and classification logic of the library, while also disordering the material. Divisions by subject, language, author, chronology, or call number are lost as different disciplines enter into new proximity. The installation may suggest a landmass, a ruin, a cenotaph, a memorial, an archive seen after its organizing system has fallen away. As viewers move around its perimeter, they may perceive shifts of height and scale, flashes, pages, irregularities, and variations. I'll make one final point before I wrap this up about data mining. And many of you may have seen the flurry of coverage about this a few weeks ago. In 2024, Anthropic purchased millions of used print books to train artificial intelligence large language models. Their bindings were stripped, their pages cut and scanned into a machine-readable files, and the originals discarded and destroyed. Internal records describe an ambition to build a centralized digital library of all the world's books, retained indefinitely. This utopian proposition rests upon a material act of destruction at a vast scale. The text is preserved as searchable data, while the object that carried it is eliminated. Data mining becomes shockingly literal. Human intellectual production is extracted, converted into proprietary computational material, and its physical source discarded and lost. More recently, booksellers in Australia, Europe, and elsewhere have raised concerns about the wider supply chain feeding these operations. They have reported large, price-insensitive orders for seemingly unrelated books, niche studies, foreign language publications, local histories, technical manuals, and decades-old out-of-print titles. Intermediaries now advertise the capacity to produce physical books for AI companies on an industrial scale while keeping the buyer's identity confidential. Anthropic states that it does not purchase or destroy rare or antiquarian books, but booksellers are skeptical, are sounding the alarm for fear that uncommon titles, perhaps the last surviving copies, are entering systems of destructive scanning without their material, historical, or cultural significance first being assessed by humans. The destruction of millions of books purchased by Anthropic is documented. The fate of books now moving through this wider and often opaque supply chain remains uncertain. There is an unsettling proximity to Opera Obscura. Many of the books offered to me were niche, foreign language, historic, and out of print, the very kinds of publications now valued by AI systems because they contain human knowledge not readily available online. This work does not try to assert that every book needs saving, nor that libraries can possibly preserve every piece in their collections. Reviews are part of collections management and stewardship. But it does ask for a reconsideration of how value is assigned, especially now, as the AI machine sends us into a new paradigm of information, transformation, and loss. Opera Obscura extends my long engagement with the archive as material evidence bound to histories and territories. I spent my final day in the gallery, walking among the stacks, measuring, placing books, and reflecting on how the violence of the fires nearby found acute form in the blackened collection, an echo of the extraction and indifference that erode what sustains life: forests, air, water, and the shared worlds written into existence and held in the body of the book. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Well,
Y'all still with me?
we're still here. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mary. That was deeply insightful and really great to get a full synopsis of your practice along with this exhibition.